This is what life was really like in a medieval village. When you think of the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Probably castles, knights, epic battles, and powerful kings. Those are the classic images we've all seen in books, movies, and TV shows. But what about everyday life? The truth is, most people weren't nobles, and they weren't off fighting wars all the time. While those grand stories were unfolding, the majority of the population lived humble, quiet lives in small villages, filled with strict customs, daily routines, and very real struggles. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through daily life in a medieval village. The work people did, how they survived economically, what they ate, how they had fun, and how they built their communities. So join us as we step back in time and explore what it was really like to live in a medieval village. Village settlements. Around 90% of the population during the Middle Ages were peasants. In the late antiquity period, these peasants mostly lived scattered across isolated farms. But by the medieval era, they began gathering into small communities that would eventually become villages and towns. It was a time of chaos and violence. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe became fragmented. There was no central authority to enforce order or lead the way. Instead, local warlords and chieftains rose to power, each claiming control over their own territories. Conquests were common. Stronger groups often tried to take land from weaker ones, leading to widespread instability. As a response, castles were built, fortified strongholds surrounded by villages and protective walls. These fortifications were essential for survival. Nobles offered protection and security in exchange for labor and taxes. Peasants worked the land, and in return, lived under the protection of the local feudal lord. The development of these medieval settlements was driven by the need for safety, not just from rival lords, but also from outside invaders like the Vikings, whose brutal raids shaped much of medieval history. That constant need for protection gave rise to walled cities. Entire communities, homes, churches, schools, markets, were built within the safety of stone walls, creating enclosed worlds designed to keep danger out. Daily life. Life in medieval villages revolved around the agricultural calendar. Most people lived to work the land. Planting, tending, and harvesting crops were the center of daily life for peasants. Those who lived near the castle were assigned plots of land to farm. Each family had their own section, but certain tasks, like plowing, were done together as a community. Peasants also helped build basic roads and cleared parts of the forest for use. But not everyone was a farmer. A portion of the population worked in trades essential to village life. There were blacksmiths, artisans, knife sharpeners, and repairmen, offering services for construction, maintenance, and crafting tools. Some peasants were actually free landowners. These free peasants had their own property and didn't owe labor or taxes to a lord. Still, most villagers lived under a feudal lord, and that relationship was mutual. It was a system of give and take. Peasants provided labor, services, and a share of their crops. In return, the lord offered protection, a justice system, access to a mill for grinding grain, a communal bakery, and sometimes even a church. The well-being of villagers depended heavily on their lord's character. If the lord was violent or involved in constant conflict with neighboring territories, the peasants would suffer the consequences, often becoming the first victims of raids and invasions. But if the lord was peaceful and generous, life in the village could be much more stable. Lower taxes, enough food, and a sense of safety could make all the difference in the daily lives of medieval peasants. The nobles. The nobility held power and control over the land. These were the feudal lords, men who gained their status either by birth or as a reward for military service. They ruled from their castles, collected taxes, and held authority over the people living on their lands. There were different levels of nobility. At the very top were the kings. Not only did they rule over vast territories, but they also held authority over lower-ranking nobles, those feudal lords who governed smaller parts of the kingdom. Knights ranked at the bottom of the noble class. They didn't own land, but they managed it on behalf of the king or a higher-ranking lord, and in return, they received a portion of the income. Life for nobles was completely different from that of peasants or serfs. While the common folk spent their days working the fields, nobles filled their time with games like chess, hunting, and listening to music performed by traveling minstrels and troubadours. Their lives were marked by privilege, power, and protection, far removed from the harsh realities of everyday village life. Types of homes. Peasants and serfs typically lived in small, simple houses. The floors were made of packed dirt, the walls built from wood, and the roofs were constructed using a mixture of mud, manure, and straw. These structures had very few windows, making the interiors dark, damp, and poorly ventilated. Inside, families lived side by side with their livestock, keeping animals indoors at night to prevent them from being stolen, attacked by wild animals, or simply running away. Furniture was minimal, usually handmade from wood. Most homes had a basic dining table, a few benches, and some storage cabinets. If the family had a bit more means, they might cover the seats with scraps of linen to make them slightly more comfortable. Beds were small and made with rough fabric stuffed with straw. They were rarely comfortable, often infested with bugs or lice, and the houses were sweltering in summer and freezing in winter. For lighting, people used candles made from animal fat, which gave off a harsh smell and produced only a dim glow. As for bathrooms, there weren't any, at least not in the way we know them today. Most people used a simple bucket, which was emptied into the nearest river every morning. Some peasants could afford to hire other serfs to help with chores. It was a common way for young people to earn money and learn trades they'd need as adults. Many young girls worked in other households and saved their earnings for their future dowries. Food and diet. The most common foods in a medieval village were based on oats, wheat, and barley, along with seasonal vegetables. People usually ate warm meals like broths, soups, and simple stews. Meat was a rarity. When peasants did eat it, it was usually from animals they raised themselves, reserved for special occasions or for the harsh winter months. What's surprising is that peasants rarely drank water. Even though it's the most basic beverage, it was often avoided. Instead, people drank wine and beer, which were seen as safer choices. Water was mainly used for washing and cooking, and here's the uncomfortable truth. It often came from the same river where waste from household buckets was dumped each morning. Fetching water was part of a woman's daily routine. They carried heavy buckets from the river to their homes, sometimes several times a day. In larger villages, access to water was slightly better. Some had communal wells or even early versions of plumbing systems, basic mechanisms that would eventually evolve into pipes and public water supplies. The role of women. Medieval life was governed by strict social rules. It was a rigid, class-based society, and it also deeply discriminated based on gender. Women were expected to play a subordinate role to the men in their family, regardless of social class. They were required to obey their father, their brother, or their husband. Even widows, who had a bit more independence, still faced legal limitations under male authority. Across all social classes, women were expected to marry young, have children, and take care of the home. That was the traditional role, but medieval women also worked, often a lot, depending on their status. Peasant women helped in the fields, cared for livestock, and were involved in textile production. Wealthier women could engage in business like their husbands. Some lent money, ran small inns, or traded goods in local markets. Poorer women often sold food in the streets or worked as domestic servants and laundry workers in the homes of wealthier families. Noble women, on the other hand, oversaw the management of their household, usually with the help of many servants. Even though their daily lives were more comfortable, noble women were still excluded from politics, the military, and all forms of government. In the church, the highest position they could attain was that of a nun. Only men were allowed to become priests, a rule that, in many places, still stands today. Entertainment and leisure. Although most of the day was spent working the land, medieval people did find time for fun and relaxation. Children played with handmade toys, surprisingly similar to modern ones. They had wooden dolls, toy swords, balls, and even played early versions of games like badminton, chess, checkers, and backgammon. Poets often recited their work in public squares, and theatrical plays were performed for entire communities. These plays were usually based on biblical stories or the lives and miracles of Catholic saints. In England, for example, one popular tale was the story of St. George and his battle with the dragon, a beast that was about to devour the king's daughter. The arts, in all their forms, music, storytelling, theater, were the main source of entertainment for medieval society. They brought people together, offered escape from daily hardships, and kept traditions alive through generations. The justice system. Although far from the legal systems we know today, medieval villages had their own ways of maintaining order and delivering justice. Theft was incredibly common, especially in poor communities. Nights were particularly dangerous. Roads became hunting grounds for bandits who attacked travelers under the cover of darkness. With no electricity or public lighting, criminals could easily vanish into the night. In some towns, watchmen patrolled the streets at night with torches, hoping to deter crime by lighting up dark alleys and hidden corners. Jails were even worse than peasant homes, small, filthy, overcrowded, and unsanitary. Prisoners received no guaranteed food or care. Their survival often depended entirely on family members bringing them supplies. Without help, they could starve to death while locked up. When it came to determining guilt or innocence, medieval justice relied on brutal and superstitious methods. One such practice was trial by combat. The accused had to fight a knight. Victory was believed to mean God had sided with the innocent. If the accused was a woman, child, cleric, or person with a disability, they could choose a champion to fight on their behalf. Another method was trial by ordeal, where the accused had to undergo a dangerous test, believing God would save the innocent. One example, being thrown into a deep well. If the person floated instead of sinking, they were considered guilty because the water had rejected them. Punishments were harsh and often wildly disproportionate. Minor crimes might result in fines or public humiliation. A common punishment was the pillory, a wooden device that locked the head and arms in place, forcing the person to kneel in public for hours or even days. It was both painful and deeply humiliating. More serious crimes like highway robbery, livestock theft, or murder were met with torture and execution, usually by hanging or burning at the stake. These executions were public events, meant to scare others into obedience. Justice was typically administered by the local noble, though members of the clergy sometimes participated. It wasn't until the early 12th century in England that the first royal courts emerged, introducing judges who were relatively independent and applying a common law across villages. This marked the beginning of more formal oral trials, with actual evidence, gradually replacing ordeals and trial by combat. Poor hygiene. During the Middle Ages, people had little to no understanding of hygiene or its connection to disease prevention. Bathing was not part of daily life, not even for the wealthy. Even nobles bathed only a few times a year. Without plumbing or modern showers, taking a bath was a major task. It required collecting and heating enough water to fill a tub, which could take hours. And after bathing, that same water had to be removed. Another difficult chore. Because of this, when families did bathe, they often shared the same water, one after another, leaving behind layers of dirt and sweat before finally throwing it out. There was even a common saying at the time: a peasant might bathe twice in his life, once when he's born, and once when he dies. The most typical form of personal hygiene was wiping the face and hands with a damp cloth each morning. In some towns and cities, people used rivers to bathe, but that came with serious risks. Thieves could steal clothes and belongings left on the riverbank. And more importantly, those same rivers were often used to dump human waste, turning them into health hazards rather than sources of cleanliness. In short, medieval hygiene was far from clean, and it showed. Diseases were everywhere. As you'd expect from a civilization without basic hygiene, disease was a constant threat in medieval life. It's estimated that half of all children died before reaching adolescence. Infections were common, affecting the skin, the water supply, and virtually every part of the body. Contagious diseases spread quickly, especially in overcrowded towns where people lived in poverty and had little to no understanding of preventive health. Flies and rats were everywhere, living side by side with humans, making it even easier for illnesses to spread. Many of the diseases that killed people back then are now treatable. Leprosy was one of the most feared. Others included smallpox, cholera, measles, and most notoriously, the bubonic plague, better known as the Black Death, which became the deadliest and most widespread epidemic of the Middle Ages. Medical knowledge was extremely limited. Although hospitals were actually invented during the Middle Ages, there were very few of them. Most people were treated at home by family members, or occasionally by a doctor. But medieval doctors were very different from the ones we know today. They often relied more on prayer and faith than on scientific evidence or proven treatments. Most remedies involved herbal medicine, a practice common across many ancient civilizations. But in some cases, treatments also included astrological readings or even spells intended to heal the sick. It was a world where science, superstition, and spirituality often blurred together. Like every human civilization, medieval society had its own rituals surrounding death, but life expectancy was brutally short. Nearly half of all children died before reaching adolescence, and those who survived rarely lived past the age of 45, an age already considered the beginning of old age. Funerals in medieval villages were simple. The body was wrapped in a burial shroud, taken to the church, and a priest would perform a brief mass with a sermon for the deceased. Peasants were usually buried in plain wooden coffins, or sometimes without any coffin at all, just the body, placed directly into the earth. The dead were buried in the churchyard, which also served as the cemetery. The word cemetery actually comes from the Latin coementarium, meaning sleeping place, a resting place for departed Christians. Life in the Middle Ages was about much more than epic battles and knights in shining armor. For most people, it was a time marked by deep inequality, hard labor, poor hygiene, and constant illness. But it was also a necessary chapter in history, one that eventually led to the Renaissance and the dawn of the modern world. Understanding how past societies lived, beyond the myths of glory, helps us see ourselves more clearly and better understand our own culture today. We hope you found this video insightful. If you have anything to add, feel free to share it in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends and family. Let them discover what life was really like in a medieval village. And if you're new to our channel, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this.